Imagine waking up one morning and learning that a tiny, hidden part inside nearly every high-tech device, from your phone to a fighter jet, might run out. That's not science fiction. In May this year, China held an emergency meeting and launched what officials called Operation Thunder, a targeted crackdown on the secret routes used to move key materials like rare earths, gallium, and germanium out of China. This wasn't a routine customs sweep. It was a surgical strike aimed at the whole shadowy chain that was quietly routing Chinese materials through third countries to countries that Beijing didn't want to supply. Why should you care? Because rare earths are everywhere in advanced tech. China currently produces roughly 70% of the world's rare earths and controls more than 90% of the refining and processing capacity. That means even if ore is dug up somewhere else, much of the finishing work, the part that turns raw dirt into the tiny, super pure metals used in magnets, radar, and chips, still happens in China. Cut off that finishing step, and you don't just slow production, you can stop entire weapon and tech lines. Here's the dramatic bit. Some defense planners say certain United States weapons and systems would only last a few months without steady flows of these materials. That's why Operation Thunder reads like a geopolitical emergency. Not because a shipment was delayed, but because the line that feeds modern industry could be choked. To see how this happened, and how companies and countries tried to hide the trail, we need to step back and explain what rare earths actually are, and why everyone treats them like strategic gold. Rare earths might sound exotic, but they're actually the invisible backbone of almost every modern device. Think of them like vitamins for technology. Tiny, often unseen, but absolutely essential for keeping things running. There are 17 elements in this group, including neodymium, terbium, yttrium, gallium, and germanium. And, well, each plays a critical role in high-tech applications. For example, neodymium is used in the powerful magnets inside electric motors and wind turbines. Without it, your electric vehicle or green energy tech just won't work efficiently. Yttrium is used in stealth coatings, making fighter jets harder to detect on radar. Gallium goes into semiconductors, powering everything from computers to satellites. Germanium is essential for fiber optics and infrared sensors. Here's a striking way to picture it. A single F-35 stealth fighter requires hundreds of kilograms of rare earths, almost the weight of 2 adult brown bears. Without them, it's just a very expensive pile of metal. Even the nuclear submarines in the United States Navy, rely on tons of these materials for sonar, propulsion, and sensors. So, rare earths aren't optional extras. They're actually the key ingredients that make modern tech and advanced weapons possible. Control these and, well, you control the flow of modern industry. China isn't just a major player in rare earths, it basically runs the show. Right now, China produces about 70% of the world's rare earths and handles over 90% of the refining and processing. That means even if other countries dig up rare earth ore, most of the world still depends on China to turn it into the super pure metals needed for high-tech applications. China's advantage isn't just about mining, it's about refining and processing technology too. Mining ore is one thing, but producing highly concentrated, industrial-grade rare earths is a whole other challenge. Few countries have the factories, experience, and patented processes that China has spent decades developing. To put the scale in perspective, as of 2024, China's proven rare earth reserves were about 44 million tons, which is almost half of the world's total. And, from January to April 2024 alone, China exported 18,000 tons of rare earths, nearly as much as the rest of the world combined in a full year. This dominance gives China enormous leverage. Any disruption in its supply or tightening of export rules can ripple through global industries, from electric vehicles and smartphones to satellites and fighter jets. But this concentration also created a problem for the United States, which depends heavily on these materials. To understand the stakes, let's look at how reliant the U.S. really is. The United States might be a superpower, but when it comes to rare earths, it is deeply dependent on China. Estimates show that up to 87% of U.S. military supply chains rely on rare earths processed in China. Between 2020 and 2023, roughly 70% of U.S. rare earth compounds and metals were imported from China. In 2023 alone, the U.S. brought in about 9,680 metric tons, and even as late as December 2024, nearly 97% of that month's imports still came from China. Faced with this reliance, the U.S. didn't sit still. It sought alternative sources in countries like Australia, South Korea, Ukraine, and Greenland. The problem? Most of these places can mine raw ore, but they just lack the refining and high-purity processing technology that China has. That means even when ore was shipped elsewhere, it often had to return to China for processing. To get around this bottleneck, the United States also used third-country transshipment channels. In simple terms, instead of importing directly from China, some materials were routed through countries like South Korea or the United Kingdom. On paper, the United States seemed to be buying locally, but in reality, these shipments often contained Chinese rare earths disguised as something else. This workaround kept supply flowing until China decided to tighten control. That's where Operation Thunder comes in. A crackdown on these gray channels that were quietly feeding the United States military and high-tech industries. In May, China launched Operation Thunder, not just a crackdown on smuggling, but really a system-wide cleanup of the entire rare earth supply chain. The focus was on third-country transshipments, false end-use declarations, and disguised exports. The very channels that allowed Chinese materials to quietly reach the United States and other sensitive markets. The operation introduced a national traceability system covering production, circulation, and export. Every company involved in rare earths must now enter real-time data on every gram of material into a central platform. So, what this really means is that from the moment ore is mined, all the way through refining, shipment, and final export, every single transaction can actually be tracked and verified. Why is this so important? Well, in the past, companies could, hide shipments by changing labels, repackaging, or even falsifying documents. But now, any unusual export pattern, like, say, a sudden spike in shipments to a third country, can be quickly flagged. For example, Chinese customs noticed that in the first quarter of 2025, South Korea's imports of Chinese rare earths jumped 137% year-on-year, while its domestic demand barely increased. Operation Thunder effectively removes the shadows from the rare earth market. What was once a gray channel full of loopholes is now under strict supervision, leaving countries and companies that relied on these routes scrambling for alternatives. The gray channels targeted by Operation Thunder weren't just theoretical, they were real, lucrative, and global. Let's start with South Korea, a key example. About 93% of South Korea's rare earths came from China, yet roughly 37% were re-exported to the United States. Some reports suggest that Samsung secretly shipped around 320 tons of rare earth oxides to American companies, disguising them as cosmetic raw materials to bypass export controls. Chinese customs noticed the spike in imports in early 2025, while domestic industrial demand in Korea grew less than 5%, suggesting that most of these materials were being funneled abroad. The UK appears to have played a similar role. In the first quarter of 2025, imports of rare earth magnets from China surged by 40%, but domestic usage only accounted for 15%. That left the remaining supply likely headed to U.S. military industries. Meanwhile, the UK publicly complained about slow Chinese export approvals, masking the fact that it was acting as a transit hub in this gray network. China also uncovered smuggling rings for gallium and germanium, where companies changed packaging, falsified documents, and routed shipments through third countries. These aren't small-scale operations. They represent a multi-billion-dollar black market in critical materials. These cases show how deeply integrated third-country intermediaries were in supplying the United States through unofficial channels. But with Operation Thunder and traceability, these loopholes are closing fast, leaving the United States military and other high-tech industries, extremely vulnerable. The tightening of rare earth controls isn't just an economic issue. It's a direct threat to national security. The Pentagon has long-run simulations showing that if China were to completely cut off rare earth supplies, most United States weapon production lines would halt within 3 months. Take the F-35 stealth fighter as an example. Each jet requires about 417 kilograms of rare earths, almost the weight of 2 adult brown bears. Yttrium in its stealth coating keeps it invisible to radar, while gallium in its engine blades allows it to withstand extreme temperatures at supersonic speeds. Without these materials, a $100 million fighter is essentially scrap metal. Even United States Virginia-class nuclear submarines depend on tons of rare earths for propulsion, sonar, and, silent navigation. Lose the supply and their high-tech capabilities could, regress to something resembling World War II-era submarines. The United States has, tried to find alternatives, seabed mining Greenland, Ukraine, and even Australia. But these efforts face some really huge technical, financial, and environmental challenges. For example, Greenland's rare earth mines come with radioactive waste and processing costs of about $300 per ton, which is far above market prices. In short, China's crackdown is not just about exports. It's actually a strategic chokehold on the world's most advanced technologies. Operation Thunder and China's new traceability system, they really mark a turning point in global resource geopolitics. By closing the gray channels and strictly monitoring every gram of rare earths, China has forced countries like the United States to confront a harsh reality. Critical supply chains are vulnerable, and, alternatives are expensive, slow, or technically unfeasible. The consequences are clear. United States weapon systems, high-tech manufacturing, and even green energy projects face potential delays or disruptions. In the short term, there could be price spikes and production bottlenecks. Looking to the long term, the United States may need to invest hundreds of billions into building domestic refining and processing, and honestly, that's a process that could take a decade. This isn't just trade policy, it's a new supply chain Cold War, where control over rare earths equals control over technology, security, and strategic advantage. For viewers, the lesson is simple. The materials behind modern life are rare, strategic, and geopolitically explosive. If you want to stay updated on how this story unfolds and learn more about the global race for critical resources, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below. Which country do you think will dominate the rare earth race in the next decade? This concludes our deep dive into China's Operation Thunder and the high-stakes world of rare earths.